Come now, and let the weight of this day slip away like shadows retreating before the first evening stars. Feel your breath slow as we step backward through the corridors of time, beyond the rush of modern urgency, beyond the familiar sounds of contemporary life, into a world where stone and marble held the echoes of empire, and where the Mediterranean night carried whispers of gods both ancient and eternal. Tonight, we walk the cobbled streets of a city that time has both destroyed and preserved, where every footstep once echoed with the certainty of Roman order, and where the philosophy of acceptance would soon be tested by forces beyond human understanding. The year is 79 in the Common Era, when the Empire of Rome stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, and when the Bay of Naples cradled cities of such beauty that poets struggled to capture their essence in verse. Here, in the shadow of a mountain that slept with deceptive tranquility, lived those who believed that civilization could tame any wilderness, that human will could shape destiny according to reason and desire. Let the concerns of your own time fade now like oil lamps dimming in distant windows, as we enter the thoughts of one who had learned to measure life not in years accumulated, but in wisdom slowly distilled from experience. Rest your spirit in this threshold between day and night, between the known and the unknowable, as we follow the evening meditations of a man who had seen empires rise and fall within the span of his own long lifetime, and who would soon witness the most profound lesson that nature could teach about the fragility of human ambition. Lucius Caecilius Serenus moved through the streets of Pompeii with the measured pace of one who had learned to extract meaning from the simple act of walking. At 68 years, his body carried the accumulated weight of decades spent in study and contemplation, his shoulders slightly bent from years of leaning over scrolls, his hands marked by the permanent stains of ink and the subtle scars that came from handling papyrus with the reverence it deserved. The evening light caught the silver threads in his hair, which he wore in the simple style befitting a man who had chosen philosophy over politics, wisdom over wealth. The city around him pulsed with the rhythms that had governed Roman life for generations uncounted. Pompeii sat like a jewel upon the fertile slopes that surrounded Vesuvius, its 20,000 souls creating a tapestry of human activity that stretched from the grand villas of the wealthy to the modest workshops where craftsmen pursued their ancient trades. The streets themselves told stories written in stone, their surfaces worn smooth by countless feet, their gutters carved with precision that spoke of engineering excellence, their intersections marked by fountains where water flowed with the abundance that Roman ingenuity had made possible. From his house near the Forum, Serenus could see how the city unfolded in concentric circles of social order, each district serving its designated function in the greater organism of urban life. The grand villas occupied the highest ground, their gardens visible over walls that spoke of privacy earned through generations of service to the empire. Below them spread the neighborhoods where merchants and artisans lived in houses that balanced comfort with practicality, their courtyards echoing with the sounds of daily commerce and family conversation. The Forum itself remained the beating heart of civic existence, its marble columns catching the last light of day while vendors finished the business that had begun with dawn. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of statues depicting emperors and local benefactors, the essential transactions of civilized life continued their eternal dance. Bread sellers counted their final coins, while their ovens still radiated warmth into the cooling air. Wine merchants secured their amphorae with the careful attention that valuable cargo deserved. Cloth dealers folded bolts of silk and wool with movements that transformed commerce into something approaching ritual. The public baths, those monuments to Roman understanding of comfort and social connection, were beginning their evening transformation from afternoon gathering places to sanctuaries of relaxation and philosophical discourse. Steam rose from pools heated by hypocaust systems that channeled fire through hidden passages, creating temperatures that could soothe muscles worn by the day's labors. Here, citizens of various ranks would soon immerse themselves in waters warmed by the same volcanic forces that heated the springs throughout the region, unconscious of the irony that the source of their comfort was also preparing their ultimate transformation. Serenus had spent 40 years walking these streets, observing the subtle changes that marked the passage of decades in a city that seemed eternal in its prosperity. He had arrived as a young man, hungry for knowledge, drawn by the reputation of Pompeii's libraries and the presence of other philosophers who had chosen this pleasant bay as their retreat from the more demanding intellectual circles of Rome. The mountain that rose behind the city had been his constant companion through all those years, its slopes green with vineyards that produced wine of legendary quality, its peak often crowned with clouds that seemed to connect earth with sky in perfect harmony. His own house reflected the preferences of a man who had learned to find satisfaction in simplicity enriched by carefully chosen beauties. The atrium contained a modest impluvium, where rainwater collected in a pool that reflected sky and clouds, creating a space where heaven and earth seemed to meet in peaceful dialogue. The walls bore frescoes that depicted scenes from Greek mythology, their colors still fresh despite years of Mediterranean sun, their figures seeming to move in the changing light that filtered through the opening above. His study was perhaps the house's most precious space, its shelves lined with scrolls that represented decades of careful acquisition and patient reading. Here stood works by Plato and Aristotle, by Cicero and Seneca, by poets whose verses had shaped Roman understanding of beauty and meaning. A writing desk faced the garden, positioned so that the act of composition could be enriched by views of flowering plants and the play of light on water in a small fountain. Oil lamps waited in bronze holders, ready to extend the day's opportunities for reading and reflection into the quiet hours of night. The garden itself embodied principles that Serenus had absorbed from a lifetime of studying philosophy. Each plant had been chosen not merely for its beauty, but for its symbolic significance and its contribution to the greater harmony of the whole. Laurel trees provided shade while honoring Apollo, god of poetry and wisdom. Roses climbed trellises in displays of color that changed with the seasons, reminding observers that beauty and transience were inseparable aspects of existence. A small shrine dedicated to the household gods occupied one corner, where daily offerings maintained the connections between family, ancestors, and the divine forces that governed fortune. As evening deepened and the first stars appeared above the bay, Serenus often stood in this garden contemplating the questions that had occupied philosophical minds since thinking began. What was the proper relationship between human will and divine purpose? How should a wise person respond to circumstances beyond mortal control? What obligations did knowledge create, and how could understanding be transmitted across the generations that connected past with future? These questions had acquired new urgency in recent months, as subtle changes in the world around him had begun to suggest that familiar patterns might be approaching their end. The earth had trembled with increasing frequency, though never with enough violence to cause serious alarm. The springs that fed the public baths had grown warmer, though this was generally considered a blessing rather than a cause for concern. Birds had begun to alter their migration patterns in ways that old farmers noticed but could not explain. Dogs occasionally barked at empty air, their behavior suggesting awareness of presences that human senses could not detect. Most troubling of all, at least for one trained to notice such things, was a quality in the light that seemed subtly different from what he remembered from previous years. The sunsets had grown more spectacular, their colors more intense, their duration seemingly extended as if the day itself were reluctant to surrender to night. The moon, when it appeared above Vesuvius, seemed larger and more luminous, casting shadows that held unusual depth and clarity. Yet these observations remained within the realm of natural variation, explicable by changes in weather patterns or atmospheric conditions that human understanding had not yet mastered. The Romans had achieved remarkable control over their environment through engineering and organization, but they remained humble before the greater mysteries of earth and sky. A philosopher learned to note such phenomena without anxiety, to observe without the need to control, to accept that human knowledge had boundaries beyond which lay realms governed by powers that required respect rather than explanation. Serenus had begun each day for the past several months with longer periods of morning meditation, standing in his garden while dawn painted the sky above the bay in colors that seemed to shift and intensify with each passing sunrise. These moments of quiet observation had become precious to him, opportunities to align his inner state with the rhythms of the natural world, to prepare his mind for whatever challenges the day might present. His evening walks through the city had also acquired new dimensions of meaning, as if familiar sights were revealing hidden aspects that previous years had kept concealed. The faces of neighbors seemed more vivid, their brief interactions carrying weights of significance that surprised him with their intensity. Children at play appeared to glow with life force that made their laughter seem like music composed by gods. Even the stray cats that haunted the fish markets moved with a grace that suggested awareness of mysteries beyond human comprehension. The philosopher in him recognized that these heightened perceptions might simply reflect the natural intensification of awareness that came with advancing age and the approach of mortality. Men in their 7th decade often reported that colors seemed brighter, that conversations carried deeper meaning, that ordinary moments revealed extraordinary beauty. Yet another part of his mind, trained by years of careful observation, suspected that changes in his perception might reflect actual changes in the world itself, subtle alterations in the fabric of reality that preceded larger transformations. As he stood in his garden on this particular evening, watching the last light fade from the western horizon while the first stars emerged above the darkening waters of the bay, Serenus felt the approach of something that remained unnamed but unmistakable. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire world were poised on the edge of a revelation that would transform understanding in ways that neither philosophy nor experience had prepared him to anticipate. The mountain that had been his companion through 4 decades of peaceful contemplation rose against the star-filled sky like a sleeping giant, its familiar silhouette unchanged, yet somehow charged with potential that made the evening air seem to vibrate with unheard music. Tomorrow would bring another day of walking through streets that had sheltered his studies and supported his quest for wisdom. Tomorrow would offer new opportunities to practice the philosophical principles that had shaped his understanding of how a man should live when faced with the eternal questions that consciousness posed. Yet tonight, standing beneath stars that seemed closer than usual, breathing air that carried scents of jasmine and distant sea salt, Serenus found himself preparing for teachings that no scroll contained, for lessons that could only be learned through direct experience of forces larger than human comprehension could encompass. The night air carried sounds that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the city, a symphony of human habitation that had played without interruption for centuries. From his garden, Serenus could hear the distant murmur of conversation drifting from taverns where wine flowed and stories were shared beneath flickering oil lamps. The gentle splash of water in public fountains provided a constant undertone, punctuated by the soft footsteps of late walkers making their way home through streets that retained the warmth of the day's sun in their paved surfaces. A cat leaped silently onto the garden wall, its eyes reflecting starlight as it paused to study this human figure standing motionless among the flowering plants. For a moment, philosopher and feline regarded each other across the space that separated their different forms of consciousness, each recognizing in the other a fellow seeker of understanding, though their methods differed as greatly as their lifespans. The cat continued on its nocturnal hunt, disappearing into shadows that seemed deeper than usual, leaving Serenus with the impression that he had been evaluated and found worthy of the brief attention that wild creatures granted to those they deemed harmless. The house behind him breathed with the rhythms of settling wood and cooling stone, its rooms gradually releasing the heat they had absorbed during the day's passage. His servant, Marcus, had long since retired to his quarters after completing the evening tasks that maintained the household's modest elegance. The oil lamps in the study continued to burn, their flames steady in the still air, ready to illuminate whatever thoughts might require written expression during the quiet hours that lay ahead. Serenus had learned over the decades to treasure these moments of solitude, when the demands of social interaction gave way to the deeper conversations that consciousness conducted with itself. The philosopher's path required periods of withdrawal from the world's complexity, opportunities to process experiences and extract from them whatever wisdom they might contain. Age had taught him that understanding often came not in moments of active seeking, but in the peaceful intervals when the mind was allowed to settle like sediment in still water, revealing clarity that activity had obscured. The bay beyond the city's walls lay like polished metal beneath the star-filled sky, its surface broken only by the gentle movement of fishing boats, whose lanterns created points of light that seemed to mirror the celestial display above. These fishermen were pursuing their ancient trade with methods that connected them to countless generations who had drawn sustenance from these same waters. Their patient work embodied a form of wisdom that complemented the philosophical understanding that Serenus had spent his lifetime cultivating, though their knowledge was written in muscles and instincts rather than in scrolls and formal arguments. The slopes of Vesuvius, visible as a dark mass against the lighter darkness of the sky, supported communities that had grown prosperous through their cultivation of grapes that seemed to draw exceptional flavor from the volcanic soil. The wine they produced was prized throughout the empire, its quality attributed to minerals that the mountain's ancient fires had mixed into earth that was extraordinarily fertile. Farmers who worked these slopes spoke of soil so rich that vines seemed to grow with unusual vigor, producing harvests that surpassed expectations with remarkable consistency. These agricultural communities represented another form of wisdom, knowledge gained through generations of careful observation of seasonal patterns, weather signs, and the subtle indicators that told experienced cultivators when to plant, when to harvest, when to allow fields to rest. Their understanding was embodied in practical skills that ensured survival and prosperity, though few of them would have thought to call their expertise philosophy. Yet their intimate relationship with natural processes contained insights that formal education often overlooked in its emphasis on abstract reasoning and theoretical knowledge. As Serenus stood in his garden contemplating these various forms of human understanding, he found himself thinking of the students who had sought his guidance over the years. Young men from wealthy families had come to him hoping to acquire the philosophical training that would prepare them for careers in government or law. Their minds had been sharp and their enthusiasm genuine. Yet most had approached wisdom as if it were a commodity that could be purchased through sufficient payment of attention and effort. Teaching them had been both rewarding and challenging, requiring him to find ways to communicate insights that could only be truly learned through personal experience. He had tried to show them that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that required constant practice and continuous refinement. The most important lessons could not be transmitted through lectures or discussions, but had to be absorbed gradually through years of patient cultivation of virtues that revealed their true value only when tested by circumstances that demanded their application. Some students had grasped these deeper aspects of philosophical education, going on to lives that embodied the principles they had studied. Others had acquired the vocabulary and concepts of wisdom without developing the inner qualities that gave such knowledge meaning beyond social accomplishment. A few had surprised him by discovering their own paths to understanding that diverged from traditional approaches while maintaining the essential commitment to truth and virtue that made philosophical life worthwhile. The memory of these various students brought both satisfaction and melancholy, as Serenus recognized that his years of active teaching were drawing to their natural close. Age was imposing its own curriculum, replacing the energy required for sustained instruction with the reflective capacity needed for synthesis and integration. The knowledge he had accumulated through decades of study and practice was crystallizing into something that felt both more essential and more fragile than the confident understanding of his younger years. Walking slowly through his garden toward the house, he paused beside the small fountain where water bubbled up from springs that connected his modest property to the vast underground network of channels and caverns that honeycomb the region. This water had traveled unknown distances through passages carved by time and pressure, emerging here to support the plants and trees that made his private world possible. Its journey from hidden sources to this peaceful destination seemed to mirror the path of wisdom itself, arising from mysterious depths to sustain life in forms that those depths could never directly know. The fountain's gentle sound created a space of calm that seemed to extend outward like ripples on still water, transforming the garden into a sanctuary where thought could move at its natural pace without the urgency that characterized most human activity. Here, beneath stars whose light had traveled vast distances to reach this particular moment, Serenus felt connected to the larger rhythms that governed existence beyond the boundaries of individual awareness. His daily walks through the city had become increasingly precious as vehicles for meditation and observation, opportunities to practice the philosophical principles that guided his approach to life while remaining engaged with the community that had nurtured his development. Tomorrow would bring another such walk, another chance to move through familiar streets with the attention that transformed routine activity into spiritual exercise. The streets of Pompeii offered endless opportunities for the kind of observation that philosophy required. Each corner revealed new aspects of human nature in action, from the patient negotiations that took place in market stalls to the spontaneous laughter that erupted when children discovered new games in the spaces between adult activities. The city was a living laboratory where theories about virtue and happiness could be tested against the actual behavior of people pursuing their various goals and responding to the challenges that daily life presented. As he prepared to enter his house and conclude this day's portion of his ongoing dialogue with existence, Serenus found himself anticipating tomorrow's walk with an intensity that surprised him. The familiar route that connected his home to the Forum and the Baths, to the harbor and the residential districts where friends and former students lived, seemed to be calling to him with unusual urgency. Perhaps age was making him more sensitive to the preciousness of ordinary experiences, or perhaps something in the atmosphere itself was charging even simple activities with heightened significance. The oil lamps in his study awaited whatever thoughts might require written expression during the quiet hours of night, while his bed promised the rest that would prepare body and mind for whatever tomorrow might bring. Yet as he crossed the threshold between garden and interior space, Serenus carried with him the impression that he was entering the final phase of a long education whose ultimate lesson had yet to be revealed. The morning arrived with a quality of light that seemed to announce itself before the sun appeared above the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that transformed the familiar view from Serenus's window into something approaching divine revelation. He had awakened before dawn, as had become his custom in recent months, drawn from sleep by an internal rhythm that seemed increasingly attuned to subtle changes in the atmosphere around him. The air that entered through the open shutters carried scents of jasmine and sea salt, but beneath these familiar fragrances lay something else, a mineral sharpness that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Standing in his garden while dew still clung to the petals of roses and the leaves of the laurel trees, Serenus performed the morning exercises that had become his private ritual of preparation for each day's discoveries. These movements, drawn from philosophical practices that sought to harmonize mind and body, were performed with the deliberate slowness that transformed physical activity into meditation. Each gesture was coordinated with breath. Each pause allowed consciousness to settle more deeply into awareness of the present moment. As the sun climbed higher, revealing the city in all its morning clarity, he could see how Pompeii was awakening to another day of the prosperity that had made it renowned throughout the empire. Smoke began to rise from bakery chimneys, where the first loaves were being prepared for citizens who would soon emerge from their houses to begin the day's activities. The streets, cleaned by slaves who worked in the hours before dawn, waited to receive the footsteps that would bring them to life with purposeful movement and spontaneous encounters. The philosopher's walk through the city began, as always, with observations that seemed to accumulate meaning beyond their immediate content. A child drawing patterns in the dust with a stick paused to examine his work with the concentrated attention that philosophers brought to their most complex arguments. A woman arranging flowers at a household shrine moved her hands with the precision that transformed simple placement into an act of prayer. An elderly craftsman opened his workshop with movements that spoke of thousands of similar mornings, each one adding its small contribution to a lifetime of dedicated service to beauty and utility. Serenus made his way through streets that told the story of Roman engineering at its most accomplished, their surfaces designed to channel rainwater toward drains that carried it away through underground passages carved with mathematical precision. The sidewalks were raised to protect pedestrians from the mud and debris that accumulated during storms, while stepping stones at intersections allowed dry passage from one side to the other. These practical solutions to the challenges of urban life embodied principles that extended far beyond mere convenience, representing the Roman belief that human intelligence could shape environment to serve human flourishing. The Forum was beginning to stir with the activity that would soon transform it into the beating heart of commercial and social life. Vendors were arranging their stalls with the careful attention to display that marked the difference between casual trade and serious commerce. The marble columns that supported the basilica caught the morning light and reflected it back in patterns that seemed to change with each slight shift in the sun's position. Statues of emperors and local benefactors stood in dignified rows, their carved features seeming to observe the daily activities with the approval that eternal authority granted to well-ordered human endeavor. Here, beneath the watchful presence of these marble figures, Serenus often encountered citizens whose lives had become intertwined with his own through decades of shared residence in this prosperous city. Marcus Tullius, a wine merchant whose success had enabled him to purchase a villa on the slopes of Vesuvius, stopped to exchange the courtesies that maintained the social fabric of community life. His face, weathered by years of travel to vineyards throughout the region, showed the contentment that came from work that connected him to the land and its seasonal rhythms. "The mountain has been generous this year," Tullius observed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of one whose prosperity depended upon forces beyond human control. "The grapes are ripening with unusual sweetness, and the quantity promises to exceed our most optimistic expectations." His hands, stained purple from handling fruit, gestured toward the slopes where his vineyards flourished in soil that seemed blessed by whatever gods governed agriculture and abundance. The conversation that followed moved through topics that revealed the complex web of relationships that bound the community together in mutual dependence and shared fortune. Weather patterns, trade routes, family news, and political developments were woven into a tapestry of information that kept each citizen informed about the forces that affected their common welfare. Yet beneath the practical content of these exchanges, Serenus detected undercurrents of uncertainty that seemed to reflect concerns too vague to be expressed directly, but too persistent to be ignored entirely. Continuing his walk through districts where artisans pursued trades that had been refined across generations of careful practice, the philosopher observed how each workshop contained its own form of wisdom. The potter's understanding of clay and fire, the metalworker's knowledge of temperature and timing, the weaver's skill with thread and pattern, all represented ways of engaging with material reality that complemented the abstract reasoning that formal philosophy emphasized. These craftsmen possessed insights gained through direct experience with the substances and processes that made civilized life possible. Their expertise embodied in hands that had learned to think through touch and movement. In the workshop of Gaius Scribonius, where bronze mirrors were polished to perfection and decorative vessels were shaped with exquisite attention to proportion and detail, Serenus paused to watch the master craftsman at work on a wine crater whose surface would soon bear relief figures depicting scenes from mythology. The old artisan's hands moved with the confidence that came from decades of practice, each tool employed with economy that made complex techniques appear effortless. The bronze seemed to yield to his touch, as if recognizing the authority that skill and patience had established over its properties. "Each metal has its own character," Scribonius explained as he worked, his voice soft with the concentration that delicate tasks required. "Bronze responds differently than silver or iron, requiring its own approach, its own methods of persuasion. The craftsman learns to cooperate with these characteristics, rather than fighting against them, achieving results that honor both material and maker." His words carried the philosophical weight that came from long contemplation of the relationship between human intention and natural resistance. The morning advanced toward midday as Serenus made his way through residential areas where houses displayed the prosperity that successful commerce and wise investment had made possible. Gardens visible through open gates revealed the Roman talent for creating beauty through the careful arrangement of plants, water, and stone in compositions that pleased the eye while serving practical purposes. Fountains provided cooling moisture during the heat of summer afternoons, while shade trees offered protection from the intensity of Mediterranean sun. These private spaces embodied principles that extended beyond mere aesthetics, representing attempts to create environments where human consciousness could flourish through contact with beauty that reflected natural harmony. The owners of such gardens understood that daily life required respite from the demands of commerce and administration, opportunities for contemplation and renewal that prepared the spirit for engagement with challenges that public existence presented. The baths beckoned with their promise of physical comfort and social connection, their marble facades reflecting the Roman understanding that cleanliness and relaxation were not luxuries but necessities for citizens who sought to maintain both bodily health and mental clarity. Steam rose from pools heated by hypocaust systems that channeled fire through passages designed with engineering precision, creating temperatures that could soothe muscles while promoting the kind of leisurely conversation that strengthened community bonds. Here, in pools that ranged from cool to quite warm, citizens of various ranks gathered to share news and opinions while their bodies absorbed the therapeutic benefits that heated water provided. The conversations that took place in this setting often revealed more truth than formal meetings conducted in official surroundings, as the relaxation that comfort promoted encouraged honesty that tension inhibited. Philosophers and merchants, officials and craftsmen, young men and their elders mingled in an atmosphere that temporarily dissolved the hierarchies that governed other aspects of social interaction. Serenus lowered himself into water that seemed to embrace his aging body with understanding that transcended physical sensation, feeling the warmth penetrate joints that had grown stiff from years of sitting at his writing desk and walking through streets whose stones had gradually worn away the resilience of youth. Around him, conversations flowed like the water itself, carrying information and observations through networks of relationship that connected every citizen to the larger patterns of regional and imperial life. Lucius Cassius, a former student whose career in local administration had brought him both success and wisdom, settled into the pool beside his old teacher with the easy familiarity that long friendship permitted. His presence carried the satisfaction of a man who had found ways to apply philosophical principles to the practical challenges of governing a community whose needs were as complex as they were numerous. "The springs seem warmer than usual," Cassius observed, his voice carrying the casual tone that marked observations whose significance was not yet clear. "The bath attendants have had to adjust their procedures to prevent the pools from becoming uncomfortably hot, though most citizens seem to welcome the increased warmth." His words contained no alarm, yet they added to the accumulation of small anomalies that Serenus had begun to notice with increasing frequency. The conversation that followed explored topics that revealed how individual awareness was embedded in larger patterns of social and natural change. Economic conditions, political developments, weather phenomena, and cultural trends were examined with the analytical skills that education had developed and experience had refined. Yet beneath the rational discourse lay intuitive recognitions that logic could not adequately address, perceptions of alteration in familiar patterns that suggested larger transformations might be approaching. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the heat of midday gave way to the gentler warmth of early evening, Serenus made his way toward the harbor where ships from throughout the Mediterranean brought goods and news from the wider world that surrounded their prosperous bay. The sight of vessels loaded with amphorae of olive oil, bolts of silk, ivory carvings, and spices from distant lands reminded him of the vast network of trade and communication that connected Pompeii to Alexandria, Athens, and even the exotic ports of India and the Far East. Here, among the sounds of loading and unloading, of sailors calling instructions in languages that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Roman commerce, the philosopher contemplated the fragility and resilience that characterized human civilization. These ships represented triumph over the challenges that distance and danger presented to those who sought to expand the boundaries of their world through exploration and trade. Yet they also embodied the recognition that no community could achieve complete self-sufficiency, that prosperity depended upon relationships that extended far beyond local control. The harbor master, a weather-beaten man whose experience had taught him to read signs in sky and water that others overlooked, approached with the respectful greeting that education and age commanded even in commercial surroundings. His observations about wind patterns and tidal variations carried the authority that came from decades of attention to phenomena that affected the safety and success of maritime endeavors. "The dolphins have been behaving strangely," he mentioned, as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. "They seem agitated, swimming closer to shore than usual, their movements more rapid than normal. The fishermen have noticed it too, though none can explain what might be causing such changes in behavior." His words added another thread to the tapestry of anomalies that had been accumulating in Serenus's awareness, though their pattern remained unclear. The walk home through streets that were beginning to prepare for evening took on the quality of ritual that transformed familiar routes into opportunities for meditation and reflection. Oil lamps were being lit in shops and houses, their flames creating pools of warmth that pushed back against the approaching darkness while casting shadows that seemed to dance with life of their own. The city was transitioning from its daytime character to its evening personality, revealing different aspects of its beauty and complexity as artificial light replaced the illumination that sun had provided. Citizens moved through these lamplit streets with the unhurried pace that marked the end of the working day, their conversations and laughter creating a symphony of human contentment that spoke of prosperity and security that generations had labored to establish and maintain. Children played games in the spaces between adult activities, their voices carrying the timeless joy that youth found in simple pleasures. Vendors offered final goods to customers who moved through markets that were winding down toward the peaceful close that each day brought. Standing once again in his garden as night settled over the bay, Serenus found himself holding observations and experiences that seemed to vibrate with significance beyond their surface appearance. The day had brought encounters and insights that felt like pieces of a larger pattern whose complete form remained hidden, though its presence could be sensed in the accumulating weight of details that normal explanation could not adequately encompass. The mountain that had been his companion through 4 decades of philosophical development rose against the star-filled sky with its familiar, reassuring presence. Yet tonight, it seemed to hold depths of mystery that previous years had not revealed. Its slopes, invisible in the darkness but known through countless daylight observations, supported communities that had prospered for generations through their cultivation of grapes that drew exceptional flavor from volcanic soil. The wine they produced was prized throughout the empire, evidence that the mountain's ancient fires had enriched rather than depleted the earth they had transformed. Yet tonight, as he stood among flowering plants and listened to the gentle sound of water flowing from springs that connected his garden to vast underground networks, Serenus felt the presence of forces that human understanding had not yet learned to measure or predict. The accumulated anomalies of recent months, the warming springs, the altered behavior of animals, the unusual intensity of light and color, seemed to be pointing toward something that lay beyond the boundaries of normal experience. The days that followed brought observations that accumulated like water gathering behind a dam, each small anomaly adding weight to the philosopher's growing sense that familiar patterns were approaching their transformation. Serenus found himself rising earlier each morning, drawn to his garden by an urgency he could not name, standing among the flowering plants, while dawn painted the eastern sky in colors that seemed more vivid than memory could account for. The mountain that had been his constant companion through decades of contemplation appeared unchanged in daylight, its familiar silhouette reassuring against the brightening horizon. Yet something in its very stillness suggested the profound quiet that precedes moments of revelation. His walks through the city took on new dimensions of meaning as small details revealed themselves with unprecedented clarity. The faces of neighbors seemed to carry additional depth. Their casual greetings weighted with significance that surprised him with its intensity. Children at play moved with grace that appeared almost luminous, their laughter creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond normal perception. Even the stray cats that haunted market areas carried themselves with dignity that spoke of awareness extending beyond mere survival instinct. The springs that fed the public baths grew warmer with each passing day, requiring adjustments that bath attendants attributed to seasonal variations, though the pattern matched no previous year in memory. Citizens welcomed the increased heat as evidence of divine favor, seeing blessing rather than warning in waters that soothed with unusual intensity. Yet among those whose experience had taught them to notice subtle changes in familiar patterns, conversations carried undertones of uncertainty that rational explanation could not entirely dispel. Marcus Tullius reported that his vintages were ripening with unprecedented speed, the grapes achieving sweetness that surpassed expectations while requiring harvest earlier than traditional timing would suggest. His workers, many of whom had tended vines for generations, spoke among themselves of behavior in plants and soil that lay beyond their accumulated knowledge. The earth itself seemed more alive, more responsive to cultivation, as if some force from below was adding energy to processes that had followed predictable patterns since agriculture began. Serenus spent increasing hours in contemplation of questions that formal philosophy had prepared him to ask, but not necessarily to answer. How should consciousness respond to circumstances that lay beyond prediction or control? What did wisdom require when familiar certainties began to dissolve? How could a life dedicated to understanding prepare for experiences that transcended the boundaries of previous knowledge? These inquiries occupied his thoughts during evening meditations that extended deeper into night hours, as if approaching events demanded more thorough preparation than normal circumstances required. On the morning when the mountain finally announced its intentions, Serenus awakened not to gradual dawn, but to earth that moved beneath his house like a living creature stirring from sleep. The motion was neither violent nor brief, but sustained and purposeful, as if vast forces were adjusting their positions in preparation for larger movements. Oil lamps swayed on their chains, while furniture shifted across floors, with sounds that seemed both alarming and strangely musical, as if the house itself were learning to dance to rhythms it had never heard before. Standing in his garden while the ground continued its gentle undulation, the philosopher felt himself entering a state of awareness that philosophical training had suggested but never quite achieved. Fear and fascination merged into something approaching ecstasy as consciousness expanded to embrace experiences that normal life had not provided. The movement beneath his feet connected him directly to forces that dwelt in depths beyond human exploration. Reminders that the solid earth upon which civilization rested was itself subject to powers that operated according to principles more fundamental than human understanding could grasp. When the shaking subsided, leaving behind silence that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, Serenus made his way through streets where citizens emerged from their houses with expressions that mixed concern with wonder. The earthquake had been strong enough to shift objects and crack walls, yet gentle enough to avoid serious destruction. Children who had experienced their first tremor regarded the event with excitement rather than terror, while adults whose memories contained previous shakings nodded with the recognition that the earth occasionally reminded surface dwellers of the mysterious activities that took place in its hidden depths. Yet this morning carried atmospheric qualities that distinguished it from ordinary seismic events. The air itself seemed charged with potential, while light took on characteristics that made familiar sights appear transformed. Colors possessed intensity that normal vision had not perceived, while shadows held depths that suggested presence rather than mere absence. The mountain, when Serenus directed his attention toward its familiar slopes, appeared to be wearing veils of mist that shifted and swirled in patterns that owed nothing to wind. As morning advanced toward noon, these atmospheric changes intensified rather than dissipated. The sky above Vesuvius began to darken with clouds that formed too rapidly and moved too purposefully to be explained by weather patterns. Citizens who had resumed their normal activities paused to observe developments that commanded attention through their departure from anything previously experienced. The mountain seemed to be asserting its presence in ways that transformed it from landscape feature into active participant in the day's unfolding drama. When the peak finally opened like a flower blooming in accelerated time, revealing interior fires that had waited centuries for this moment of expression, Serenus felt his philosophical training crystallize into direct understanding. The column of ash and stone that rose into the sky embodied principles that theory had described, but only experience could teach. He stood transfixed by beauty that contained terror, and terror that revealed beauty, watching the birth of forces that human civilization had learned to forget, but that remained eternally present beneath the surface of apparent stability. The ash that began to fall like snow in summer carried the weight of revelation, each flake containing particles of rock that had been transformed by temperatures beyond earthly comprehension. As these remnants of the mountain's interior settled on rooftops and gardens, on statues and fountains, on the careful arrangements that human intelligence had created to serve human purposes, Serenus understood that he was witnessing the return of matter to its elemental condition, the dissolution of forms into the substances from which they had emerged. His neighbors responded to this unprecedented situation with behaviors that revealed the depths of character that normal circumstances rarely tested. Some gathered their most precious possessions and began journeys toward distant safety, their movements marked by urgency but not panic. Others retreated into their houses as if familiar walls could provide protection from forces that operated on scales beyond architectural resistance. Still others stood in streets and gardens, mesmerized by phenomena that transformed their understanding of the relationship between human agency and natural power. Serenus found himself moving through the city with purposes that seemed to emerge from sources beyond conscious decision. His feet carried him toward the harbor where ships were departing with unusual haste, their holds loaded with passengers whose faces reflected the recognition that this day marked the end of life as they had known it. Yet rather than joining those who sought escape through distance, he turned back toward streets that were growing darker beneath ash that fell with increasing density. Walking through districts where lamps were being lit in midday darkness, the philosopher discovered citizens who had chosen to remain with places and possessions that represented lifetimes of careful accumulation. Their conversations carried the calm that came from acceptance of circumstances beyond personal control, while their actions demonstrated the dignity that conscious choice could maintain even when options were severely limited. These individuals had achieved the state of philosophical preparation that theory described, but that could only be tested through direct encounter with ultimate questions. In his own garden, beneath trees that were accumulating white coverings that transformed them into sculptures of ash and time, Serenus experienced the convergence of intellectual understanding with immediate reality that marked the completion of philosophical education. The teachings he had absorbed through decades of study revealed their true significance as guides for consciousness, facing experiences that transcended normal boundaries. The wisdom that had seemed abstract when encountered in books became practical knowledge when applied to circumstances that required courage beyond ordinary demands. The house around him began its gradual surrender to forces that acknowledged no distinction between natural and artificial, between intended and accidental, between precious and common. Ash accumulated on surfaces that had been polished to perfection, while tremors shifted objects from positions that careful arrangement had established. Yet rather than experiencing this dissolution as loss, Serenus found himself recognizing it as transformation, the return of temporary forms to the eternal substances from which all manifestation emerged, and to which all manifestation inevitably returned. As darkness deepened beyond any night that normal seasons provided, and as ash continued its patient accumulation on every surface that the city presented, the philosopher settled into meditation that felt both final and beginning. His consciousness, trained through years of disciplined attention to observe without attachment, witnessed the gradual burial of the world he had known while maintaining equanimity that philosophical practice had slowly developed. Death, when it came, arrived as fulfillment rather than termination, the completion of a course of study that had prepared him for graduation into understanding that life alone could not provide. Centuries later, when archaeologists carefully removed ash that had preserved the city like amber preserving insects, they found evidence of lives that had continued their essential patterns even as transformation approached. Bread remained in ovens where bakers had been preparing the day's provision for community nourishment. Wine rested in cellars where vintners had been aging harvests that would never reach maturity. Books lay open on tables where scholars had been pursuing questions that the eruption had answered in ways they could not have anticipated. Among these preserved traces of interrupted existence, the house where Serenus had spent his final decades revealed the life of a mind that had achieved the integration of wisdom with experience that philosophy had always promised, but rarely delivered. His study contained scrolls whose margins bore notations that recorded insights gained through daily application of theoretical principles to practical situations. His garden displayed plantings that reflected understanding of beauty as both aesthetic and spiritual phenomenon, arrangements that continued to teach even when their creator could no longer tend their growth. The writings he left behind, scattered among libraries throughout the region and preserved by students who had recognized their value, carried forward insights that the eruption had crystallized rather than destroyed. His observations about the relationship between acceptance and resistance, about the nature of change and permanence, about the proper response of consciousness to circumstances beyond prediction or control, became teachings that influenced philosophical development for generations who never knew their source. Modern visitors who walk through the excavated streets of Pompeii at closing time, when tourist crowds have departed and shadows lengthen among ruins that retain their ancient mystery, sometimes report experiences that suggest the persistence of presence beyond physical form. The stones themselves seem to hold memories of lives that achieved completion through their encounter with forces larger than individual intention could encompass. The very ash that ended one form of existence preserved evidence of consciousness that transcended the particular circumstances of its historical manifestation. In quiet moments, when evening settles over the archaeological site and guards make their final rounds through districts where bakeries and taverns, workshops and villas maintain their patient testimony to human aspiration, something that might be wisdom continues to breathe through spaces that once contained the daily activities of citizens who learned to live with dignity beneath the watchful presence of a mountain that taught its own lessons about permanence and change. The bay still reflects stars that shine with the same light that guided ancient sailors. while Vesuvius rises against the night sky with slopes that support new vineyards, cultivated by those who understand that beauty and danger often occupy the same ground. The springs that once heated Roman baths continue to flow from depths that connect present moment to geological time, their warmth carrying forward the energy that shapes Earth's surface according to principles that human intelligence can observe but never fully control. Rest now, knowing that consciousness, which achieves true philosophical preparation, transcends the particular circumstances of its historical expression, becoming part of the eternal conversation between finite understanding and infinite mystery. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of waves against shores that have witnessed countless approaches to wisdom, and allow yourself to settle into the peace that comes from recognizing your own participation in patterns larger than individual life can encompass. The night that embraces both ruins and dreams, both memory and possibility, both ending and beginning, extends its gentle invitation to rest in the understanding that philosophy's greatest gift is the recognition that temporary forms serve eternal purposes, and that consciousness, which learns to observe without attachment, discovers its own indestructible nature through direct experience of transformation that no amount of theoretical knowledge could adequately prepare it to receive.